right. So it looks like we have 2 task force members. I was hoping that we would have more folks show up today. But considering we are 7 minutes after the hour, I think we should just go ahead and get started. And, you know, maybe we can keep this meeting a little bit shorter. It's a good thing that it's recorded, because then maybe folks can go back and listen to the parts that are especially pertinent, maybe like the overview that Elizabeth is going to provide. So let's go ahead and get started. And before we jump into the agenda, Diego, I'm going to turn it over to you to provide our language justice statement. Okay. All right. I think.
Hi, everyone. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you.
Great. Good morning, everyone. Diego Ponce here on behalf of the Community Language Cooperative. I'll be joined shortly, hopefully, by my colleague Alejandra Arrieta from working on behalf of the Community Language Cooperative. Thanks as always for having us at your meeting. We continue making a commitment towards language justice. So all this means is that we're here to help create a space for people to participate and engage in the language of their heart, just simply the language that you feel most comfortable in. We'll use simultaneous interpretation to help create the space in English and in Spanish. So once I finish saying this in English, I'll repeat it in Spanish. At that moment, interpretation gets turned on. Once interpretation is on, you'll be able to see a globe icon that says interpretation there in the bottom right-hand corner of your computer screen. Please select that globe icon when it appears on your screen, and please select your preferred language. If you happen to be joining today's meeting on your cell phone or your tablet, however, I'll ask you to please look for the More button or the 3 dots button in order to select your preferred language that way. So if you're not fully bilingual, we'll encourage you to please select your preferred language so you may utilize the interpretation whenever someone's going to be speaking in the opposite language. If you are bilingual, however, you can just feel free to listen to everyone in the original language. You will not have to select the language channel, and you will not ever have to hear our voices. As always, when you select your language, you can check the original audio, so you don't have to be hearing both languages at the same time. As always, we like to remind all audiences just to please pay attention to the speed in which you're speaking, especially the English-speaking audience. Since Spanish tends to be about 20% longer than English, just please make sure that you're trying to speak at a conversational pace, and please make sure that you do not pick up your reading speed. So thank you so much for that. Buenos días a todos y todas. Mi nombre es Diego Pons. Estoy aquí hoy con mi colega Alejandro Arrieta, de parte de la Cooperativa Comunitaria de la Justicia del Lenguaje. Como siempre, muchas gracias por invitarnos hoy a su reunión. Los organizadores de esta reunión se han comprometido a servir la justicia del lenguaje. Lo que eso significa es que queremos crear un espacio para que todas las personas puedan participar e involucrarse en el idioma de su corazón, que es simplemente el idioma en que todas las personas se sientan más cómodas. Y hoy vamos a utilizar la interpretación simultánea aquí en Zoom para poder crear ese espacio en inglés y en español. Cuando yo termine de decir esto, vamos a activar la interpretación. Ya cuando la interpretación está activada, usted va a poder observar un icono de un globo terráqueo que dirá interpretación allá abajo en la derecha de su pantalla. Por favor, seleccione ese icono del globo terráqueo y por favor, seleccione su idioma preferido. Si usted está asistiendo a esa reunión en su celular o en su tableta, le vamos a pedir que por favor busque la opción que dice el More, que quiere decir más, o posiblemente el botón de 3 puntos para que usted pueda seleccionar su idioma preferido de esa manera. Si usted no es completamente bilingüe, le vamos a aconsejar que por favor seleccione su idioma preferido para que pueda utilizar la interpretación cuando alguien está hablando en el otro idioma. Pero si usted sí es bilingüe, se puede sentir libre hoy de escuchar a todos en su idioma original. No tenía que seleccionar ni un canal de idioma y jamás tienen que escuchar nuestras voces. Y como siempre, cuando usted seleccione su idioma, puede hacer clic en silenciar el audio original para no escuchar ambos idiomas al mismo tiempo. Muchas gracias.
Awesome. Thank you, Diego. And just bear with us for a moment while we're just making sure that we get interpretation re-enabled. Okay, and then if we could just test Diego and Alejandro's interpretation. Okay, awesome. And then Morgan, if you could make me co-host, that would be great. All right, Great. Well, welcome everyone. Thank you so much for attending. We are hoping that a few more task force members will join us. It looks like we have Tyson and Elizabeth with us here today from the task force. So I'm just going to go ahead and get us started on a recap and kind of get us grounded on where we are at in terms of the supplemental environmental projects conversation. I have warned our interpreters that we will be using the acronym SEPs throughout this meeting. And SEPs refer to supplemental environmental projects. So as a refresher, some of you task force members may remember that in April, we had a task force meeting where we invited 2 staff from CDPHE, Elizabeth Scherer and Rachel Roussel Diamond, who are also actually joining us here today. And they provided the task force with background on SEPs and protocols for community-based processes. At that April meeting, we also heard from a couple of community members, Lucy Molina, a Commerce City resident, who is on the review committee for the Suncor SEP. We also heard from Olga Gonzalez, the executive director of Cultivando, a nonprofit organization in Commerce City. And we heard from both of them kind of on the pros and cons of SEPs, and they kind of were the starting point of shaping our SEP recommendations. We then had further discussions. We actually held a focus group meeting in person in Commerce City at the Eagle Point Rec Center in August. We heard further from community members, including Lucy, as well as some other community members like Maria Zubia, who were on the review committee for the Suncor SEP. And they really helped us further flesh out the recommendations and get them to where they are today. We did have a brief conversation about the existing recommendations at the August 25th meeting in Grand Junction, where we took, we kind of gauged the temperature on a few of the different recommendations. And I think from that conversation, it became really clear that, between April, it's now September, that task force members might want a refresher on SEPs and just kind of like regain an understanding of what SEPs are and kind of create the distinction that we kind of reference SEPs and then also the grant program that the advisory board will be developing, the Environmental Justice Grants Program. And so to kind of really create that distinction and help understand both the SEP program as well as the EJ grant program, we thought we would invite Elizabeth Scherer back into the space. Elizabeth is the SEP coordinator. And so she's here with us today to refresh this audience on background about the SEP process and ensure you all have a really clear understanding of what SEPs actually are. So once we feel that is accomplished, we'll then begin to review the recommendations in reverse order. And we'll drop a link to those recommendations in the chat in just a moment here. They were included in that email that I sent out last week. But we're going to review the recommendations bottom to top because we feel like we might be able to get through some of those like later recommendations a little bit faster. So we'll start with section E, then D, C, B, and then go on to A. But before we jump into the recommendations and start, discussing them in more detail, I do want to turn it over to Elizabeth to give us an overview, a recap of SEPs, and then we'll pause for a few minutes to see if anybody has questions for Elizabeth. Before we get started, any other questions from our task force members? And welcome, Beatriz, I saw you just joined. Okay, not hearing any. So, or sorry, Tyson, are you trying to come off mute? Okay, just making sure. Okay, cool. Great. So we will go ahead and turn it over to Elizabeth.
Good morning, everyone. Let me share my screen. All right, can everybody see that okay? Excellent, thank you.
Yeah.
So thanks everyone for listening to my little talk on supplemental environmental projects. This is a reused presentation from our community focus group in August, so I hope you don't mind, but I did also add a slide with a little more information. So we will jump right in. Supplemental environmental projects are projects that are funded by enforcement actions with regulated entities on their air permits, their water permits, or their hazardous waste permits issued by usually by the division. We do have some federal supplemental environmental projects. We determine how to do, I'll get back to that, sorry. So we have eligibility, funding, typical community SEP, and a little bit of information about the Suncor community SEP process so that we have some more discussion points for the recommendations. Supplemental environmental projects are projects that benefit the environment or public health and safety that are funded through the environmental enforcement actions, like I mentioned. There's 5 different SEP categories, which are pollution prevention and pollution reduction. These two are similar in that you often see energy efficiency projects or emissions control improvements come out of these 2 kinds of categories. We also have environmental restoration. Here you often see wetland restoration, tree planting, areas that were damaged by wildfires where they'll clean out debris and plant native plants. Environmental education, so these have to have an action component with them. So for example, if we have a greenhouse for a high school built, they have this environmental education piece where they set up a curriculum around this greenhouse. The students work in the greenhouse, they can serve that food in the cafeteria. Projects like that you'll see in environmental education. And then also public health and safety. So here you might see gas monitoring wells for perhaps methane that's leaching from old landfills. So you may set up monitoring wells in buildings nearby or just out in the land. SEPs have a lot of beneficial outcomes. So this is a summary slide, and this does not include all of the benefits that we've seen from SEPs. And they only include SEPs from 2009 to 2020. So we have many more SEPs than are captured here. I just don't have all the data assembled yet. So as you can see, we've had reductions in greenhouse gases. We've saved lots of water. Large amounts of trails and stream banks are restored and repaired. Habitats restored. We're producing energy. We're reducing energy. So we've had a lot of wonderful improvements come out of SEPs. And these are usually, we try to keep them in the area where the violation occurred. So at a minimum on the county level, if we can get even closer to the area of violation, that's even better. To start this slide, I want to mention that there's 2 kinds of SEPs. There's first-party SEPs and third-party SEPs. First-party supplemental environmental projects are done by the regulated entity. And so we don't want to see, as you'll see in the second bullet point, it says it cannot reward the regulated entity. So meaning we don't want to see the regulated entity have a violation, make improvements to their building or their production, and then see a benefit out of their violation. If they're going to do a first party SEP that improves their facility, we want to make sure that it's an emissions reduction for the community nearby and that they won't see a benefit for at least 5 years from that, financially mostly. So, and then anything that, for example, if they sell equipment, they have to subtract what they made from what they're going to invest in the SEP. So we want to make sure that really the benefit is going to the community, not the regulated entity. Third-party supplemental environmental projects are where the money is given to a nonprofit or a government agency that then runs the project for the area. Third-party SEPs are more common than first-party SEPs, though we do see both regularly. Supplemental environmental projects have to be voluntary. They cannot be something that was budgeted for or planned. We want to see projects that would not happen if not for the SEP and SEP money becoming available. And like I mentioned earlier, we would like to see this happen at a minimum in the same county where the violation occurred. If we can get closer, we love to get closer. Then they have some eligibility criteria that we prefer. So we may give some preference to SEPs that meet some of these bullet points. In particular, we're looking at health equity and environmental justice. We're using the Colorado EnviroScreen tool quite a bit now in determining what kind of projects may be beneficial, areas we want to focus on. Projects that support pollution prevention and decrease climate change. And then also these other, but I don't need to read all of these to you. And so you'll see here, we're trying to get more community support. If there's community support behind a SEP, that holds a lot of weight for us because we want to be sure that we're providing projects to the community that they would like to see. And we want to see a measurable impact. From that slide before, you could see we want to be able to measure kilowatt hours saved or kilowatt hours generated from solar or wind. We want to be able to measure the impacts of these supplemental environmental projects. This is the typical funding process. We'll locate SEP options in the area of the violation. I do have a supplemental environmental project library list where there are some projects that have been submitted. I have already reviewed. They appear to be really good project options. And so when a regulated entity knows that an enforcement action is coming, they can go into this library and decide if one of these projects will be a good option for them in the community. We also often have the regulated entity come with project ideas with local governments or nonprofits. We then select the appropriate project for the violation, and then we notify the project recipient. We then work on signing the enforcement document and the supplemental environmental project agreement. These are often done in tandem. Depending on the division, it's easier for them to, when they reference the SEP, that both of those are coming at about the same time. To fund the projects, the regulated entity writes the check directly to the nonprofit or government agency. This is convenient because CDPHE, the state health department, never sees the money. The money goes directly from the regulated entity to directly the folks running the project. And then we implement the project. And that's one of the things I support in. I make sure that the project is running on schedule according to the budget, that they're meeting the requirements that were set out in the project agreement. This is what the typical community supplemental environmental project process looks like. We'll send out a request for applications. We'll hold several question and answer sessions. We'll have an evaluation committee that can discuss and look at all the options and produce selections. This is typically taken about 6 months. As a disclaimer, I have not run this process. I've been in this position for only 5 months, so I haven't been able to do this yet. But this is how it typically looks. And that's a lot different than the Suncor community supplemental environmental projects process worked. The Suncor process was a much larger financial amount than is normally seen through supplemental environmental projects. And it was decided to fund multiple projects instead of just one or two. So they selected 5 projects to come out of this enforcement action. The process took 16 months instead of the typical 6 months. And there was focus groups developed and individual interviews. So the community members, there was a lot of community members on the evaluation committee. There was also a representative from the regulated entity because remember, SEPs are voluntary. So often the regulated entity has, in non-community processes, often is the one who picks the supplemental environmental project. So they did, Suncor did have a representative on the evaluation committee that had a vote. They had multiple meetings throughout this 16-month timeline, and it had an external facilitator and a community navigator associated with the process. And that is the quick and dirty of supplemental environmental projects. I'm happy to take any questions.
Yeah, I had a quick question regarding the voting process. How many people typically are on a committee? Because there's been a lot of conversation around the voting process, and how critical do you think that is to, enforcement, people who are under enforcement actually doing SEPs? I mean, do you think removing the voting from that will have an effect on people actually participating in SEPs?
Thank you so much for that question, Tyson. I think I'm going to ask Rachel to jump in because she has a lot more history here. But to answer that second half of your question, I believe it was referencing essentially if we don't allow the regulated entity to have a vote, will they do fewer SEPs? And I do think that's true in some cases. I don't think that'll be true for every regulated entity, but it'll probably be true for several. Rachel, do you have comments on the number of people that are generally on selection committees?
Yeah, for the Suncor process, we actually had, I think, 7 community members, 1 CDPHE and 1 regulated entity on the committee. That's my recollection, and that's about the size that I recall. I think it sort of depends on the opportunity, how big the funding opportunity is, how many folks we have on that, but that's was what we used with Suncor. So it is 1 vote out of 9, but it does have an impact in the. Oh, sorry, there we go, Heather. 9 community members, 1 Suncor and 1 CDPHE. I think in previous cases with Weld County, we've had a little bit of a smaller committee, and I think the committee size was increased with Suncor in particular, just because of the interest and wanting to get additional voices to that table.
Thank you very much for that.
Any other questions for Elizabeth?
I have a quick question, Lubna. I was kind of curious, Elizabeth, what is the process for community buy-in and participation during the SEPs to ensure that the community that is impacted really feels like they have a voice and that it's growing trust in these process, and there's that clarity and that, and then also if there's any support from our agency for smaller organizations that might want to apply for a SEP. And a lot of times we know that smaller nonprofits don't have like the grant making, or they've never done this before. Is there a process for like a first time or people that are interested in SEPs projects or receiving some of these funds to start diversifying who gets these types of grants?
Thank you so much for that question. And stop me when I forget pieces to answer certain pieces of it. To encourage community participation, I'm trying very hard to reach out to local governments and local nonprofits who are working in those communities that have a much better handle on what those communities need, as opposed to me, who's just, grounded here, right here in Glendale. And so I've been reaching out to them, trying to gather more SEP ideas that way, and making sure that we have some SEP ideas in the SEP library that are ready to go. We are working on additional ways, on brainstorming additional ways to include more community SEP, more community involvement in supplemental environmental projects, meaning trying to get them to participate in conversations about what kind of projects they would like to see. That definitely needs more work. And for these smaller nonprofits and organizations that aren't familiar with how to apply for or run a supplemental environmental project, we encourage them to partner with another foundation who has experience, and then they can do a mentorship that way. I also have some bandwidth to assist in some of the smaller parts. So if they just need help knowing how to write up a status report, I mean, I can absolutely jump in and walk them through that and make sure they have all the pieces there. What else am I missing from that? And Rachel probably also has some additional helpful background.
I think you covered it pretty well. It was 2 long questions.
Yeah.
Thank you.
And honestly, for the task force, if you have thoughts on how to get more community involvement, please reach out to me. I want to hear them.
Yeah,
I know
the
there's a
only thing,
community outreach part, right, to our work. Lubna, right, that there's a committee for that. So I know there's going to be some good, strong recommendations there. But I'm just wondering how, when we talk about environmental justice, we also talk about the SEP projects and like all of it together, like in a comprehensive way. So it doesn't seem like they're all these different, I mean, they're obviously different processes, but I think it is important that when we get community to pay attention, or we have people in the room, that we can have a plan to delineate like everything that's available, even if it's at a very high level, so people know that there's different ways to engage in processes.
Yeah.
Sorry, Rachel, I interrupted you.
no problem. I just wanted to add that I think that there could be some really good synergies that exist in the future with the Environmental Justice Grant Program. For example, there might be projects that don't get funded, right? There's not enough funding for everyone to be funded. We could then funnel, those unfunded projects to our idea list. We have also had Elizabeth working on making that idea list available online, so that we can perhaps look at ways of having feedback mechanisms and seeking input on those ideas ahead of time, before we're looking at actually funding or using those ideas. So those are a couple of things that I've kind of been thinking about. But again, as Elizabeth said, I think we're open to suggestions from the committee and looking for ways to improve.
Thanks for that, Rachel. Miles.
Thanks so much, Elizabeth. Miles Hoffman with Lotus Sustainability. We work a lot with local governments that are putting together sustainability action plans and recommendations to put forth to council. And many of them, most of them, if not all of them at this point, are looking for that environmental justice component of these environmental actions. As we're working with leaders in these cities and counties, should we be referring them to you if they're not already connected to you to add projects to this library, or to check and see if there's money coming down the pathway within their region? Would that be helpful for you?
Hard yes.
Okay, excellent. Then I'll connect with you after this meeting offline, and we'll get a conversation going.
Wonderful. Thank you, Miles. Any other questions or comments? Well, I very much appreciate everybody's time. I appreciate everything the Environmental Justice Task Force is working on, especially related to improving supplemental environmental projects. So thank you, everybody. Hope you have a great day.
Awesome. Thank you, Elizabeth. And yeah, while we have become relatively familiar with SEPs over the past few months, I think the reminders and the refreshers about kind of what distinguishes that program from others is always really helpful, especially as we go into this conversation to kind of refine these recommendations further. So Joel has dropped the link to the recommendations in the chat. And Joel, are you comfortable doing a screen share as we go through and do kind of like a potential line editing? Great, thank you so much. So as I mentioned, we, having the background that we do have now on SEPs, let's go through some of the recommendations that, have been developed not only by you task force members, but through the public comment process and through, the focus group that we led in Commerce City. So we're going to start at the bottom here with simplifying applications. And so I'm just going to read through this quickly and just pause for a moment to see if there's any feedback here from our task force members. So one of the major recommendations around SEPs is that CDPHE should simplify the SEP applications to make them more accessible to small community groups with limited staff capacity and or limited English proficiency. Additional SEP staff should be hired to provide administrative support to help community groups with grant support. And there's a note that the task force recognizes that these additional resources are necessary for smaller community groups to be on equal footing with larger organizations when applying for SEPs, especially through the community-based SEP selection processes. So I'll give folks a moment to process that and just want to see if there's any further additions or elaborations on that specific recommendation. And please keep in mind that, if we're talking about whether or not this recommendation is satisfactory. And I hate to do this, but like you don't necessarily like have to come off mute and reiterate your support for this recommendation. It is in the recommendations because the task force members or community members or through public comment, we have received support for this recommendation, which is why it's in the report. We staff members did not develop this. So this is really coming from you all, and this is kind of like a double check to see, hey, does this jive? And if so, is there any changes that you would make to it? Otherwise, we'll kind of consider this relatively final as we go into the October meeting. So just keep that in mind for all the recommendations as we're going through here. What we really want to hear from you is feedback on if anything needs to be changed. So I'll pause there, give folks a moment to kind of process, and feel free to come off mute or raise your hand if you have any comment.
So one question or comment that I had was in regards to the additional SEP staff hired to provide administrative support. If that administrative support is not constant and year round, I would be concerned that eventually would become a non-needed staff member. So could we just change the language to say that the CDPHE will provide additional administrative support? That way, if there is a full-time job that's needed, they can hire staff. If there is part-time work needed, they could hire a third party to help administrate. And do you see what I'm saying? From a budgeting and planning standpoint, just knowing running a company, I look at that and I'm like, wow, I'm going to have to hire somebody when I might not need somebody all the time.
Oops, sorry. Thanks for that, Tyson. And for our SEP staff, especially Elizabeth and Rachel, and of course, Heather, you're on as well. If you have any, as task force members are providing feedback on the SEP recommendations, if you have any initial thoughts or comments, that's why it is really beneficial to have you all in the space. If you have any reactions to what the task force members are saying, so we can get to kind of some realistic recommendations that make sense for everybody, that would be really helpful. So thanks, Tyson, for that. And I welcome Elizabeth or Rachel to comment if you have anything. Otherwise, we'll go to Beatrice.
Yeah, it probably would have been a better question for them than statement. Would you think you would need a full-time person all the time?
It's hard to know, though, given my current workload. I don't only do supplemental environmental projects, I'm also a work lead. So I have 2 other staff that are working on various projects or various other work tasks. And so it's difficult to say, but if we're essentially going to have an on-staff assistance for all community SEPs for these small nonprofits who need more assistance in getting SEPs done, then I think we definitely will need at least a half-time person, if not a full-time person, to also lead a revamped community SEP project. I know that the lift for the Suncor community SEP process was enormous compared to typical community SEP processes. So it could be really helpful to have another full-time person to do this more focused community SEP processing and assistance for smaller nonprofits to get more folks involved.
Thanks, Elizabeth. Beatrice.
Hi, I wanted to say I think that the language looks good, and I just wanted to ask the question if we should add awareness or information for community. I know that takes resources, time, staff to really, share that this is available to communities and when they're available and to more diverse constituencies, I would say, and just maybe just adding that component. So just general information that this is available, and then obviously in multiple languages or the language of the community.
Beatriz, I don't want to pivot us too far, but would it be okay if we kind of work that in section A, actually? So that's the section on sort of soliciting input on the community, on the IDEA library. So that's the library that Elizabeth was just talking about that kind of has ideas. Do you think what you're talking about is more broadly, like more broad awareness of SEPs, or with this recommendation, like in general, not just kind of opportunity of like what types of projects can apply, or do you think your comment could kind of be worked into the recommendations in this section?
I would say both, right? Because we want more input for the library, but I think we also want more people to know about SEPs and that they exist. And I don't know if they're the same or they could be in the same kind of bucket, but I definitely think there needs to be just more general education awareness that they exist. And that people can comment and influence, right? And add ideas to the library and just general information about them.
Thank you.
I think it can live anywhere, Joel, wherever you find it appropriate. I just want to make sure we don't, because again, it takes resources, it takes time, it has to be embedded into the process.
Thanks, Beatrice. Great point. Any other comments around that to either Beatrice's comment or to this general recommendation about simplifying the application? Okay, so, generally seeing support around this, and I just want to echo that we saw the same type of support at the August meeting. There wasn't a whole lot of discussion around this recommendation, but I think general sense of support for this recommendation. So with that said, I'm going to move us on to section D. And so note that for this section D, which is really focusing on the role of the regulated entity, at the August 25th meeting in Grand Junction, we did do a straw poll about this question regarding this role of the regulated entity in a community-based SEP selection process. And we didn't really establish a clear preference for one of these options over another. So just to kind of give people a refresher, so we have these three options. Option one is that the SEP process should be amended so that if the entity that is the subject of the enforcement action participates in a selection committee with community members, it would not have a voting role, right? So in this case, if we're talking about the Suncor SEP, Suncor would not have a voting role in the selection committee. Option two is that if the entity that is the subject of the enforcement should continue to be able to participate with a voting role on the selection committee in recognition that SEPs are voluntary actions by the regulated entity. So basically saying that, yes, the entity that is the subject of enforcement action should have a voting role, right? So as they're sitting on the selection committee, they would be able to vote, and recognizing that the SEP process is a voluntary process. So they've chosen to take part in this process. And so, yes, like they should have a voting role in participating however they would like. And then there's this third option that the community where the enforcement action is taking place should determine where the entity that is the subject of the enforcement can participate on the selection committee and whether they will have a voting role or not. So just to review, option one is that the subject of the enforcement action would not have a voting role in the selection committee. Option two is that they would have a voting role. And option three is that it's up to the community where the enforcement action is taking place to decide whether they have a voting role or not. When we had the meeting in August, only one task force member voted for option one, meaning they didn't think that the regulated entity should have a voting role. There were 7 people that voted for option two, and there were 6 people that voted for option three. And there were actually 4 people that abstained. So we were kind of a little bit across the board here. I also want to recognize that we did send out a survey in advance of the meeting. And in that survey, we actually, this option 3 came later, right? So option 3 is actually an option that was developed by one of the community members during the focus group that we held in Commerce City, where they kind of came up with this medium ground, but okay, maybe it's every SEP is going to look really different. So maybe the community should be the one to decide, whether the regulated entity has a voting role or not. When we sent out the survey on draft recommendation 1, we only had option 1 and 2. And about 60% of people voted for option 1. And this is out of almost 200 responses. About 28% of people voted for option 2, and then about 24% voted for option C, which was maybe. It was kind of like neither here nor there. It was kind of I guess like in between. So, while our survey results from the members of the public voted in heavy favor of that the regulated entity should not have a voting role, that was about 60% of the votes. When we had the August meeting, the task force members, only 1 person voted for that option. And so we're wondering at this point, do we want to, now that we have this, we have 3 different options here, yes, no, and let the community decide. No, yes, and let the community decide. Do we want to take out option 1, considering the task force members didn't really vote for this, and the survey results may not be as reflective, considering the options changed since we gathered those results. So I want to kind of open it up for discussion here. And even if you don't feel strongly about one of the options, maybe just thinking about a path forward for the October meeting, and how we want to kind of lay these out, and also if you need just more clarity on the different options.
Somebody's got to start before me this time.
Now, I was just going to ask Lebner, can you just kind of repeat where the survey landed? This is uni.
Yeah, so out of these three options, option 1, 2, and 3, the survey only collected responses for option 1 and 2 because option 3 did not exist at the time that the survey was released. As a reminder, option 3 came from a community member during the focus group that took place in August. And that focus group took place after the survey was released. So the survey, the way people landed, if you're only looking at option 1 and 2 on the screen here, about 60% of people voted for option 1, meaning, no, the regulated entity should not have a vote. 28% of people or 29% of people voted for option 2. This is yes, that folks should have, the regulated entity should have a voting role. And then 24% said maybe, they're not totally sure. They kind of fell in the middle. Thanks, Joel. I think having the exact results up on the screen is helpful. So this is where folks landed. And just keep in mind that option 3 on the recommendation screen is not equivalent to option C here, because option C was just maybe. It does not equate to this new option that we've come up with. And then just to reiterate, at the August meeting, we had 18 people vote, and out of those 18, only 1 person voted for option 1. 7 people voted for option 2, 6 people voted for option 3, and 4 people abstained. And abstaining, gives us the sense that folks need more information, more time to discuss, which is why we're bringing this to the space here to see, what else do we need to talk about, and or do we want to have a discussion about this?
And maybe just one additional kind of point of context. I think a lot of our discussion at the August meeting centered around the idea of the risk that I think Tyson raised earlier of, if the regulated entity doesn't have a voting role, it might not pursue the SEP, right? It is a voluntary process, so they might withdraw or just choose not to do a SEP in the first place, or a community-based SEP process in the first place. So I think that risk was probably what was guiding a lot of folks thinking, though of course I don't know. And of course it is worth keeping in mind that we have to keep our surveys as short and concise as possible. So we weren't able to provide that degree of background information in the survey. So members of the public may not have been aware of that, though they may have been as well. We don't know who all filled out the survey. So hopefully that's an additional helpful background context point.
Yeah, that's really helpful, Joel. And kind of looking at this, I know we discussed the possibility of it, but with Elizabeth here and her confirming that, yes, there would be companies that would probably not participate if they did not have the ability to vote, kind of makes me look at this entire thing differently. I was never really a fan of the options as they were, because they were kind of are you in or are you out option. They didn't really satisfy, they either satisfied one side or the other. That option 3 in my mind still doesn't really, it still creates the same issue as option 1, because I mean, if the community votes them out and they say, fine, we're not going to do the project, that's not helpful to anyone. So I would, to me, in my mind, it makes more sense to satisfy both of them by keeping it as the entity does get to vote, and then create a minimum of 5 people on the committee, because that keeps the entity and the CDPHE as minority in that. And now everybody should be satisfied that one, they have a vote and you have a minimum of 5 people on the committee. And then you don't have to worry about options. That's just the standard. And I think everybody would have the ability to, come to the table. The entity would, the voting entity would be able to voice their opinion, which I think is important, because if the voting entity at any point in time just says that I don't want to deal with this, I'm going to go pay a fine, that's not helping the community in any way, shape, or form. So I would like to see it, and it forces more engagement in between the entity and the community, which I think is always good. In any scenario, there needs to be more interaction between them. So that's my 2 cents. I think if you just set it at a minimum of 5 people on a committee, that would keep the voting entity as a minority, and you wouldn't have to worry about axing them out or keeping them on.
Thanks, Tyson. Any others have like reactions to that or other thoughts? And, you know, again, I welcome a dialogue amongst the SEP staff as well. If you have any, you know, if you have any food for thought for the task force members.
I guess my question is, how was it done in the past? I mean, maybe I'm just late to the conversation and I apologize for that.
Yeah, so I can kind of chime in with what I know, and then Elizabeth, if you want to elaborate a little bit. But for the past review committees, there is a voting seat for the regulated entity. So there's, you know, when you have a selection committee, it's comprised of community members, and then there's 1 seat for the regulated entity, and then a CDPHE staff. I think that's traditionally what has happened. And everybody has a vote. And so, Elizabeth, I don't know if there's anything else that you want to share there, but.
Yeah, I'm hoping actually Rachel can jump in, because she has a lot more history on how these have gone in the past. So.
I mean, how many members were on the committee prior to, you know, this conversation? Did it vary by location, or was it something that was prescribed as a part of the program?
You mean, so prior to the Suncor community set process, what did they normally look like? Okay, I hate to say this, I'm actually not sure, and that's a really great question. So it doesn't look like Rachel's with us anymore. I will get that answer.
Okay, thanks. No, but I do support Tyson's suggestion, because it takes away from it just being symbolic. I mean, if you have a prescribed number, then it carries some weight, versus, you know, industry or whoever the regulated entity is, and a committee of, let's say, 15 people, you know. And so I don't know if we need to go that much in the weeds and say how many people should be on the committee, but I do support the way Tyson is looking at it.
Thanks, Uni. Any other thoughts? And I'm just looking at the task force members here. Dominique, Beatrice, and I know Elizabeth had to drop off. Any others have thoughts on this?
Hi, this is Dominique. I'm just joining. So are we trying to decide between option 2 and 3, or just apologies, just trying to figure out what we're deliberating at this point.
Yeah, I guess, you know, if you're comfortable speaking to kind of which option you would be in favor of and kind of rationale around why. We heard from Tyson and Uni kind of a push for option 2, with kind of the caveat that we would have at least, you know, 5 community members taking place in the selection committee, so that there was like balanced voting for, you know, the
Yeah,
regulated.
and sorry, I was clarifying with Joel. I was saying having at least 5 members on the committee, which would put CDPHE plus the voting entity would still be a minority, even as those 2. So the community would still be the majority.
Got it. Okay. So just an emphasis on yes, option 2, but that the community would have the majority vote. So that's kind of what we've heard so far in terms of feedback. But curious to hear from task force members if there's, you know, if there is like further support for any one of these recommendations. And then as we go into the October meeting, I mean, considering that option 1 only received 1 vote at the August meeting, you know, should we take option 1 off the table prior to the October meeting so that we can have more of a narrowed focus while we, you know, because these recommendations need to be final, you know, within the next month or so. And so we would like to, you know, we're going to have to get rid of these options, right? Like as a task force, you all are going to have to put forth a solid option that you have consensus around. And so I guess we're trying to see if we were to eliminate one of these options, you know, if the task force thinks that's the way we should go, then should we take option 1 off the table and maybe just have more of a conversation between option 2 and 3? Or is there, you know, is there more information that you all need to kind of help better make a decision?
This is Dominique. I am in favor of taking option 1 off, given that it had little support. And then I would think that a brief conversation between 2 and 3 and maybe making any additional clarifications would make sense. Myself, I also lean to option 2, but I could see somewhere between option 2 and 3, you know, a few clarifications getting people to support one versus the other. But I do think wherever we can take out options that had little support in that first voting round, that will help us to just have less time spent on this. So makes sense to me.
I want to clarify, wasn't option 1 in the survey the one that got the most support?
Yes, option 1 in the survey prior to option 3 existing did get the most support of 59.3% votes. So 118 people out of 199 voted for that option.
I just want to make sure if we're asking people to participate and community members to spend their time filling out surveys and giving us their feedback, that should weigh pretty heavily.
Yeah, and then I think one thing to just keep in mind is that we have administered a second round of surveys on this latest draft of recommendations. So we'll have, at the October meeting, we'll have updated numbers for these options, and we have 3 different options. So hopefully those results will be more reflective. But as you all know, the public comment period goes until October 14th. So we're still getting weigh in from community members. But yeah, your point is definitely valid, Beatrice.
And
Well,
Beatrice, oh, sorry, Tyson, just quickly, I'll note that's the whole reason we did keep it in, to have this discussion, right? Otherwise, we would have just removed it given the lack of task force support, but we were hesitant to do that as staff just because we knew the survey results and saw how mixed the other options were. So we really wanted to have this conversation right now. Sorry to cut you off, Tyson.
no, I guess my question is how to better inform the public, because if we had 123 surveys, I have not seen 123 different members of the public at our meetings. So there are a lot of people from the public who are voting who are voting on these surveys who don't have the full wealth of knowledge of attending all of these meetings. So is there a way when we do these surveys to make sure that we're getting accurate information out to them? Because in my opinion, especially in this situation, this is a perfect situation of, we have confirmed that there will be people who back out of these voluntary SEPs, which will reduce the number of SEPs being done and potentially reduce the overall impact of these SEPs. That is a huge thing that I don't know how you put that in a survey, but that, to me, that completely changes my view on all of this. You know, when we first got the survey, I was one of the people who was like, oh, that option one doesn't sound, you know, too bad. Why would it matter if they're voting or not, if they're, you know, volunteering to do this? But then the other question came about. So, and now I'm completely against option one. I think that would be sabotaging the SEP program by doing something like that. So how do we make sure that the public that's voting on this has all that information?
Honestly, it's a big challenge, right? You know, we have to assume that the folks filling out the survey have probably never heard of a SEP, because who has heard of a SEP, right? Like, we all have, maybe regulated entities have, the communities who have applied before, but we know that's a relatively small fraction of the population of Colorado, which is obviously something we want to change. So we did try to provide as much background information as we could in the survey, but we also got a lot of feedback on the first survey that it was too confusing. And we definitely saw some attrition as folks went through the survey. Like, there were more respondents to earlier questions than there were to later questions. So ultimately, and I will just own this as my own judgment call, I did not add additional information on sort of the pros and cons of the options in the next iteration of the survey, just because it would have made the question even longer and more complex. And I was a little worried about that attrition. So the way it's phrased does just say some sort of explain what a SEP is, but it doesn't explain the sort of risks and benefits of each of the options. So unfortunately, it's sort of too late to change the survey since it's been out for a month now. And we did not kind of take that extra step of explaining the risks and benefits. So there will be, unfortunately, the same potential lack of information driving the responses in the next iteration.
Yeah, and so I think that's fine. I think we just need to make sure, instead of glossing over it, like I don't think we should take option one off now, but I think if we address them in our full meetings and we say, this is why we're making this decision in contrast to what was voted on by the community because of all this other information, and we don't want to, you know, I think we're going to have to do this on multiple pieces of this, because there are so many nuances to every single one of these recommendations. There's no way a non-participating public person from the public who has not sat through any meetings or listened to anything or read through any materials is going to be able to give an accurate survey.
Yeah, point well taken, Tyson. And, you know, we try our best to put, you know, all of the meeting recordings, put the notes, everything in a place that's publicly accessible. But yeah, to like have the onus be on community members for them to go through every single recording and like read through the notes and really have a strong understanding of what SEPs is to like most accurately respond to the survey question is, it's kind of a bit far reaching. So it sounds like,
as long as we address it and we say, hey, you know, the voting from the community did come out this, but here's why we're making this decision. I think that's fine.
I have a question. This is Dominique. When we voted last time, didn't we already have that first round of survey data?
yes.
So, I mean, I guess I totally understand it's very important to consider the public input, but in my mind, that was already considered, and option one still only received one vote. So just in the interest of, you know, trying to move forward, I guess I'm still okay with us moving down to option 2 and 3, given all the context that, Tyson provided in terms of, the additional background information, which is just really, really difficult to provide to the community. I'm just looking for ways where the task force can kind of focus its attention. And so I feel like, yes, totally understand there was a above majority vote by the public for option 1, but we already knew that, and that option was still, not favored by many task force members. So I would still be okay with narrowing sooner rather than later.
Thanks.
A good point,
And Elizabeth, I see you've had your hand raised, so please do come off mute and feel free to share.
Excellent, thank you. So just real quick, I want to just come back to a question that was asked earlier about the number of community members that have been on selection processes in the past. And it doesn't look like there was ever a set number, but we did add many more for the Suncor community set process than they had ever had in the past. There's also in the chat a comment from Christopher Koya, and I believe it's asking essentially, is there a way to assess the cost of a regulated entity funding a SEP as opposed to paying the CDPHE, the fine, as a way to incentivize folks to participate in the community SEP process? Please let me know if I have the interpretation of that question incorrect. I think for most regulated entities, maybe not most, but I think they'd rather put money into their community than give CDPHE money. So I think that's just one of the ways that we hope that they will fund community set processes. I'm not sure if there's, but there's also this, for a first party SEP, if a regulated entity decides to do a first party SEP, there's a mitigation ratio of a minimum of 1.5 to 1. So that means if they have a violation of $100,000, they have to invest $150,000 to do a first party SEP, so that they don't receive, some sort of financial benefit for improving their facility. Otherwise, I'm not sure if there's a way to adjust the penalty amount to incentivize community SEP versus to incentivize more community participation, but it is something I can be thinking about. And if other people have suggestions, I want to hear them.
Yeah, welcome thoughts on that, as Elizabeth mentioned.
So are you saying that the community SEP has the same 150%, or is the community SEP just flat?
It's flat. So if they do a third party SEP, which is usually when a community SEP process will be, it's the same rate.
Okay.
Well, and I also wonder if this question is getting at, can we pay community members to be part of a community process? And we did pay, or we provided some sort of financial benefit for the Suncor community SEP process folks. So I know we've talked about making adjustments to that.
All right, so for the sake of time, we are going to move forward. I think what we will do is kind of have this preliminary note to potentially remove option 1 from the options for discussion at the October meeting. However, please note that this is a question that is in the survey, and the survey results will not be final until October 14th. So if there is something noteworthy where, the majority of people, members of the public, vote in favor of option 1, we will still bring that to your attention. But I do think that, what Tyson has mentioned is that this task force is charged with really getting the full context of every option and really talking through the pros and cons of each. And so, I think both Beatrice's point and Tyson's points are valid, right? That we should keep in mind, how members of the public are voting, but while also understanding the complexity that the task force understands each option. So just keeping that in mind as we go into the October meeting. So thanks all for your input on that. We will wrap up the role of regulated entity and move on to section C, which is on procedural requirements for community SEP selection processes. So we didn't discuss this much at the August meetings, which is why we want to dive into it today and see if there needs to be further discussion on this, or if task force members are still on board with this recommendation. So I'll just briefly read through this here. So the recommendation around this is, and this we're looking at C on the screen here, CDPHE should revisit conflict of interest requirements for community-based SEP selection processes to avoid unintended barriers while maintaining safeguards to prevent misuse of funds. CDPHE should clearly explain conflict of interest requirements and other procedural aspects to community members participating in SEP selection committees at the outset of the process. So being really clear about, the conflict of interest. Similarly, CDPHE should revisit confidentiality requirements to ensure they are not unduly restrictive. CDPHE should ensure that community members fully understand the implications of their participation. And in this case, we're talking about participation on a selection committee and what it means for their future participation with SEP funded projects and interaction with SEP funding applicants during the SEP selection process. Where possible, CDPHE should ensure that community members participating in the selection process are a representative cross-section of the community. So we heard some support for this recommendation at the meeting, kind of looking back at the notes, and just wanted to kind of pause to see if there's anything else that folks want to add, further discuss, and just see if task force members are still on board with this recommendation. I'll pause, I'll give it a minute. I know folks might want to read through this again on their own.
So one of the questions that I had in regards to the confidentiality stuff, is that are those elements of CDPHE's rules and regulations that need to be addressed in a rulemaking, or are those just simple administrative changes? Because I feel like if it's gone through a rulemaking, that's a different thing than if it was just, this is CDPHE's administrative policy on confidentiality.
Jason, I'll go ahead and answer that, and then I'm not sure if Elizabeth will want to add anything, but this is not a requirement from a rulemaking. This is a CDPHE administrative policy. So the SEP process is created by statutes, by the legislature, but there's no regulatory structure guiding sort of how it is implemented. There's no board or commission, for example, that's charged with adopting those regulations. So that, if you think about the overall, I'm going to take a huge step back here, but the overall picture of the task force, you are charged with making recommendations to the legislature, the governor's office, into CDPHE. Most of your recommendations fall in the first two categories, right? They're things that would require a legislative or a regulatory change, and thus the sort of decision-making vests with the legislature or the governor's office. This SEP section, for the most part, with limited exceptions like, funding additional staff, this whole section is directed to us at CDPHE. So this, in general, you can assume that the recommendations in this section are things that CDPHE has a discretionary authority to do. All that said, the sort of confidentiality provisions are, though they are not regulatory in nature, they are obviously things that have been developed through a series of best practices and experiences by our procurement teams and our internal audit team, of sort of learning from past challenges that have arisen in other grant making processes. But I think kind of the gist that we heard from community members is that these kind of best practices that have been developed over time, that tend to be on, multi-million-dollar, very big grant processes administered by something like the Board of Health, the same types of requirements just might not make sense in these much smaller scale community processes, especially when everyone on a selection committee is selected because they're already active in the relevant community. It really does sort of restrict just who they can talk to or what they can and can't talk about with their neighbors or family or folks they see at school drop off, right? So I think that was kind of what we heard from the community members who participated in the SEP process is, should there be different requirements or sort of best practices applied for confidentiality on the selection committee?
Yeah, no, I really appreciate that better explanation. I think I don't really have any issues with this other than, the not without knowing the details of what all that stuff is, and not that we're going to get into that, but I just want to be cautionary to the same comment of before we don't want to scare people away from doing SEPs. We want people to do more of these. But we also don't need any Brett Favre volleyball facilities being constructed and on funds that should have gone to a better community. And sorry for that little bad joke there, but that was pretty amazing that stuff like that actually happens in this world. But so I'm supportive of it, understanding that I do not want to create a situation where people are like not coming forward doing SEPs because of something that was removed from that.
Noted, and thanks for capturing that, Joel and Morgan. Other task force members have thoughts on this procedural requirements for community SEP selection processes. And, any feedback is welcome, like clarification on wording, or, if you want to discuss it in further detail. And again, there was general support, like some support expressed for this, but we didn't really talk about it that much at the August meeting. Okay. I want to, give people the silence they need to kind of reread through this, which is why I'm allowing for the long pauses. I know that I myself, as I'm like going through processes like this, it's very helpful to reread. But if I'm going to take the silence as just general support for this recommendation, unless anybody wants to speak up. Okay.
I do want to apologize. I do have a doctor's appointment at 9:30, so but sometimes I'm in the waiting room for a while, so I'll still be listening until I drop off. But I probably won't be participating in as much.
Okay. Thanks for that heads up, Tyson. So with that said, we're going to move on to section B. All right. So I don't want to bore you by reading through this fully. And maybe I'll just kind of read through the first couple of paragraphs and then give folks some time to maybe reread through this on their own. But this is a section that's ensuring that SEPs are indeed benefiting impacted communities or disproportionately impacted communities. So when a violation occurs in a disproportionately impacted community, the recommendation here is that priority should be given to enforcement penalty revenue going back to the disproportionately impacted community where the violation occurred, either through a SEP or by funds going into the Community Impact Cash Fund, which is in the case of the Air Pollution Control Division. That's the Air Pollution Control Division's penalties. That's what the Community Impact Cash Fund is. So either through SEPs or Community Impact Cash Fund or both. Those are kind of the avenues where the penalties should go back to the disproportionately impacted communities. SEPs should be prioritized for violations that occur in those communities to ensure the revenue goes directly back to the community that was harmed by the violation. Now, I just want to provide a refresher, kind of an explanation around this next part. Starting in fiscal year 25-26, the Air Pollution Control Division should prioritize SEPs on enforcement actions that go through a community selection process, or where a community requests a SEP through the process by submitting a project to the SEP idea library. So to be clear, this next part of this recommendation that I just started reading came from the advisory board, to really understand the implications of this recommendation. And I'm going to do a quick screen share of a slide here, and I've shown this to you all before, and I just want to reiterate this. And then Morgan, if you could just give me screen sharing capability. I don't think I'm co-host yet.
Lumna, I can just call it up if it's easier. I already have it on my screen.
Great, thank you. Okay, so this is with regard to this paragraph that I just started reading, starting in fiscal year 25-26. And some folks might be wondering, okay, why did the advisory board put this forward? Why did they mention year 25-26? This is what's going to happen to the Community Impact Cash Fund over time. So with the air penalty revenue that is going into the general fund currently, 20% of that revenue went into the Community Impact Cash Fund last fiscal year. Currently, 40% is going into the Community Impact Cash Fund. In the following fiscal year, 60% of that air penalty revenue will be going into this Community Impact Cash Fund. And it won't be until fiscal year 25-26 that 100% of all of that air penalty revenue will go into the Community Impact Cash Fund. To be clear, the Community Impact Cash Fund is the source that will be funding the EJ Grants program. The EJ Grants program is what the advisory board is developing right now. We are hoping to launch that request for application in November and have funding be available by summer of 2023. So keep in mind, air penalty revenue is going into the general fund. As of right now, like to this day, 40% of that revenue from the general fund is being filtered into the Community Impact Cash Fund. And that Community Impact Cash Fund is going to be funding the EJ Grants program. And to just provide a little bit more background, the EJ Grants program is going to be funding projects in disproportionately impacted communities. Further details around that is like, this task force, for example, is further developing the definition of what a DI community is. So we don't want to go down that rabbit hole of like exactly what a DI community is. We have a separate subcommittee for that, and we'll be talking about that later. But I do want to just have people kind of have this visual in your mind of this is when all of the money for air penalty revenue, year 25-26, that's why that's written into the recommendations. And here's a clear visual as to how that funding will be allocated. All right, so with that, going back to the recommendations, the recommendation here is that, SEPs should benefit disproportionately impacted communities, either through the SEP process or through the Community Impact Cash Fund. And there's this clear recommendation. Oh yeah, and thanks Joel for that context in the chat. So there's this clear recommendation by the advisory board that specifically starting in year 25-26, when all of that funding, the air penalty revenue funding, will be going into the Community Impact Cash Fund, that's where we should be prioritizing these projects. So I don't know if it's helpful for me to read through all of these paragraphs in detail. I think what I will do is kind of stop talking, give folks a moment to read through this on their own, and just see if there's feedback around these recommendations, around these few paragraphs of ensuring that SEPs go to disproportionately impacted communities. And please keep in mind that the draft of the recommendations is on our public drive, and Joel, well, I can actually drop a link to the SEP recommendations again, if that is helpful for people to read on their own as opposed to looking at the shared screen. Yes, Heather, please feel free to come off mute and provide any further context if that's helpful.
Yes, so for the second paragraph in this section, the first sentence, I'm just not sure what the intent is. And so I don't know if you have any context for what the intent is. So it says the Air Pollution Control Division should prioritize SEPs on enforcement actions that go through a community selection process. So I'm wondering if it means that the Air Division should prioritize community SEPs, like SEPs selected through a community process. I'm just not sure what it means, and so I was hoping for some clarification.
Yeah, and Joel, maybe you can explain this better than I'm explaining it now, but the idea is that currently, SEPs, all SEP projects take place in the communities where the violation happens, right? Projects that are going to be funded through the Community Impact Cash Fund, so the EJ grants program, those projects might not necessarily be in the same communities where certain violations are happening. And so there is this opportunity that in the year 2025, fiscal year 25-26, all of the projects through the EJ grants program will definitely be going to DI communities. All the funding will be going to DI communities. And so when people are kind of debating on whether they should go through a SEP selection process or through the EJ grants program, if they do go through a SEP selection process, that it should be a community selection process. Joel, do you have a better way of explaining that?
Yeah, maybe like a sort of concise reframing is that what the advisory board really discussed at its July meeting, which is what led to this recommendation, is that it was important to the advisory board that there was some form of community oversight over the distribution of penalty revenue. And I think the advisory board was somewhat agnostic about whether that came from the advisory board itself through the Community Impact Cash Fund, or whether it happened through community members participating in a community-based SEP process. But the purpose or the idea or the intent, to answer your question, Heather, was that idea of community oversight and how the revenue was distributed being important. So does that help clarify?
Yeah, I'm wondering if it might be more clear if you get rid of on enforcement actions. So the Air Division should prioritize steps that go through a community selection process. I think that's the part that's throwing me off a little bit. Because the enforcement actions don't go through the community selection process, it's the steps. Does that make sense?
Thank you for that wording clarification. Yeah, we do a lot of live wordsmithing in large public meetings, and we'll never get it right the first time. So really appreciate that.
Yeah, thanks, Heather. Elizabeth?
Yeah, and Heather may want to chime in about this too. So the wording for, where does it start? The task force recognizes that the length and complexity of community selection process can lengthen the duration of enforcement process and potentially delay a violated entity from coming back into compliance quickly. I actually believe that these are unrelated, meaning that a SEP community selection process actually has very little to do with very little or nothing to do with a violating entity being in compliance, coming back into compliance. A violated entity should be coming back into compliance regardless if there is a SEP. And so a community selection process and the length it takes to like get a SEP going should have nothing to do with them coming back into compliance. They're required to do that right away.
Yeah, so the compliance order on consent, which is the document that resolves the enforcement case, has separate deadlines for any sort of compliance requirements. It's completely separate from the SEP process.
Thanks, Heather.
So, and just to make sure I accurately reflected that means you would sort of suggest removing this this line, and I can't remember which task force member raised it as a concern last time, but obviously we didn't have the expertise on the line from staff, like the two of you, to correct us. So thank you for raising that.
Yeah, and probably then also adjust the front end of that next sentence. You could just say the task force recommends encouraging SEPs.
Yeah, I appreciate that that thoughtful eye in being able to wordsmith this so that it's as accurate as can be. Other, in addition to the SEP staff, any other task force members, as you've read through this, and I have dropped the link to the SEP recommendations in the chat if it's helpful for you to look at it on your own. This is starting on page 1, section B, ensuring that SEPs benefit impacted communities. And again, I'm happy to kind of sit through the silence as you folks read through the recommendation, but if there's any feedback or clarity needed on this.
while folks are reading, maybe an additional question of, in addition to feedback on the draft, it's valuable for us to know as staff if there's any additional information that you all need as task force members to help provide context or help you make decisions about this recommendation at the October meeting. So if your reaction to reading it is, I feel confused, like, let us know, and we can try to work through that to make sure you have the information you need to make a final decision in the coming weeks.
Okay, I'm going to give it about 30 more seconds. And feel free to raise your hand if you just need more time to just kind of process. I don't want to rush this, and we do have time. I want to give people the space they need. So if you just need to raise your hand just to kind of bookmark it as you're just continuing to think through. Otherwise, in about 30 seconds or so, we'll move on to the next section, assuming that folks are understanding this and in agreement with it and support this recommendation. All right, great. So it looks like, and again, thanks Heather and Elizabeth for helping us wordsmith this. If folks have further comments on this moving forward, please do share them. But it looks like this recommendation's in a pretty good place. I think, you know, to me, it reads pretty well and explains where the task force sits on this. So we're going to go ahead and move to section A, the final section of the SEC recommendations. And this section is really focused on soliciting early community input through the SEP Idea Library. So the recommendation here is that CDPHE should make the SEP Idea Library readily accessible and easy to find. And if you're curious as to what the SEP Idea Library is, there is a hyperlink there where you can click on that and see kind of these different project portfolios in this like central library space. So, you know, maybe putting that in a more visible area. So the SEP Idea Library should include criteria and categories of projects that relate to specific categories of violations to help keep a close connection between the nature of the violation and the project chosen. Ideas that were not selected by community SEP selection committees should also be included in the Idea Library so that they can potentially be funded by other SEPs in the future. So things that were not selected and, you know, did not receive funding through the SEP selection process. The idea is that, you know, there's an archive of those projects that were submitted, and that they kind of folks can still kind of look through them in hopes that they would be funded in the future. The EJ Advisory Board should definitely review projects in the SEP Idea Library to inform the board's choice of projects to fund through the Environmental Justice Grants Program. So again, referencing those older projects that were not funded and seeing if maybe they want to fund them through this other funding opportunity through the EJ Grants Program. And then lastly, in this section, CDPHE should conduct outreach, including public meetings, about the existence of community-based SEP processes and the SEP Idea Library to raise awareness about the Idea Library and get community feedback on ideas that should be included in the library. The Environmental Justice Advisory Board should help facilitate or contribute to this outreach process. And regulated entities should also engage local health departments and community-based organizations to seek input on environmental and public health priorities for SEPs. So I will pause there, give folks a moment to reread on their own if they'd like to. And again, not much discussion on this during the August meeting. So we were wondering if you want to further discuss this or, again, I will interpret the silence as support that you are still on board with this recommendation, and we'll just push it through for the October meeting.
Beatriz, I don't want to call on you or call you out, but after having a little more time to reflect, especially on that last paragraph, are there any language changes or additions you think we should consider making to it, given your comment earlier about the importance of sort of building awareness and making information available to communities? And it's totally fine if not. I just wanted to give you the opportunity to weigh in on any specific language changes.
Thank you, Joel, for checking back. The thing that I'm kind of just, and sorry, I'm just a lot of information is, do we have a sense of, in the past, which communities SEPs have benefited, if there's lessons learned? This is why we have an Environmental Justice Action Task Force, is because there is environmental injustice, and some of the decisions of the past are impacting, present outcomes and health outcomes. So I guess my question here is, I love this idea of making it more accessible, of, having this SEP library. As part of this is, what have we done in the past? Who has it benefited? Do those projects, if we planted trees, are those trees alive and well? Is there like accountability in some of the funds that have been given in the past, and are there lessons learned so we don't make the same mistakes? And maybe there's like these ideas that seem to be really good. Are there measures that we can be like, we already did this and it wasn't very successful, or we tried this and it went to an affluent community, it didn't go to a disproportionately impacted communities? So anyway, I'm just kind of curious from like what information we gathered back to see, how those SEPs were implemented in the past to make sure that, we are achieving our goals to improve the lives of disproportionately impacted communities. So anyway, I know that's just a lot, but that's like what's boiling up inside of me, like some of those questions in terms of, do we have information regarding some of that?
Thanks, Beatriz. And Elizabeth and Heather, I wasn't sure if you wanted to respond to that before we move on to Uni's question or comment.
Sure. Beatrice, that's a really excellent question. Unfortunately, I wish I had an answer, and it kind of bothers me that I don't have the historical background on, all the SEPs in the past. I mean, I have data about what some SEPs accomplished at the time and those sorts of metrics, but I don't have a historical background on how are those SEPs now. Like, to your point, right? Did a bunch of trees were planted? How is that doing now? Or a restoration project happened. Is it now full of invasive species again? Has it been maintained? I don't actually know, and I'm not sure how to create the bandwidth to keep up on stuff like that. I'm so sorry. I just don't feel like I have. I think that's such a great point and something that's probably really needed. I just don't have it.
Thanks, Elizabeth. for that honest answer, and maybe a consideration for how the task force wants to further elaborate on this recommendation. Uni?
Yeah, I think that goes to the conversation we had in our committee meeting, our subcommittee meeting, Beatrice, when we were talking about performance indicators. We may be able to wrap this into one of those things that we need to track around SEPs, especially as they were used in DIC communities. So I think that's important. Thanks for raising that point. I think this is kind of one of those broad comments, I guess. I followed the link to the SEP idea library, and I clicked on it, and I wanted to see what information is collected as a part of the process. And honestly, it goes back to the complexity of these issues. Personally, I thought it was just going to be a library of all these great ideas where somebody says something like, we need air conditioners at the school or something, some wish list, like a wish list, I guess. But I think a part of it is you have to be able to have a budget. You have to be able to maybe talk about the expected benefits of the environment, what are the public health benefits? And it's seeking a lot more information than I think an average member of the community might have. And it speaks to this whole idea of providing the community with the technical support, or the support that they need to be able to fill out a form like this one, to be able to turn their wishes into reality. Because I don't even know if I had a project I had in mind, if I would have the time or the bandwidth or the knowledge to think about some of the questions that I asked on the form. I mean, I recognize they're important questions to know when selecting a project, but just making it more accessible to a community member.
That's a great point. Thank you for that. So one thing is that when you click on this is a little separate from the comment. When you click on the link, it takes you to this spreadsheet that feels overwhelming. However, I have a new Tableau format that should be being launched soon that makes it much easier to search and view projects. To your point about the complexity of having to submit information for a project, the problem I run into is that in order to determine if it's a viable SEP, a SEP that meets the criteria that can be funded through enforcement actions, I have to have this information. And so my hope is that when people have ideas, they either can talk to their local nonprofits or sponsors, or reach out to me directly to say, I have this idea. How do we figure out all these other pieces for it? And I or a sponsor can help them brainstorm what the measurable impacts would be, how much would that cost, that kind of stuff. That's my hope. Not sure how to execute the communication of, if you have a SEP idea, get in touch with me per se. Like if you have a SEP idea but don't have it fleshed out yet, you can reach out to me. My contact information is on the website, but it doesn't specifically say that. So I hear you. I'll be working on that. And if anyone has a suggestion, I would like to hear it.
Yeah, I think, the subcommittee that's doing the community engagement, maybe they also need to include a little blurb in there, to kind of, so that we don't lose sight of this specific avenue to support environmental justice communities. Like I said, we didn't address it when we were talking within the data subcommittee, and so this is good. And Renee, I agree with what you're saying.
Thank you. Hi, Lowe's. Sorry to join late. I had another meeting until 9:30. That puts way too much on DR communities and completely invalidates why you need consistent equity analysis. that we're talking about immigrant communities, we're talking about indigenous communities. This is trauma also that they're living in, and you're asking them to reach out. So these aren't just their ideas, their needs at this point. And being a little bit more sensitive about what they're going through and meeting them at where they're at shouldn't consistently have to put that type of onus on DI communities, because that's how we create cumulative impacts. So being a lot more mindful with more sensitivity about where their cultural aspect, their trauma aspect, that's what I mean by sensitivity. Is that also going to be in Spanish? Do we also make sure that it's kind of in a simplistic form where there's continual outreach, that if they have an idea, they can just send in a video or an audio or some type of database? Is there already a consistent database for nonprofits that you work with locally that they'd be able to have those avenues as a buffer or a bridge? And if those don't exist, to put that much in those assumptions is too many assumptions on them. And then that we go right back to the status quo of nothing happens, and it just feels like silence or crickets from a DI community that knows their needs, but doesn't know how to communicate them to you properly and doesn't feel adequately and equitably extended the platform.
Thank you so much, Renee. I'm making notes on all those things that you just said so that we can start thinking about accessibility and reaching our communities where they are. So thank you.
Yeah, thanks all for your added input around this recommendation. I think we've heard some areas of improvement, not only for the wording here, but for just the general SEP idea library that will be helpful. Any other task force members have input in our last minute or so here? All right. Well, thank you all so much for your engagement. And through kind of sitting through some of the silences, I know that that can sometimes feel uncomfortable for some folks, but I also know that as somebody who has definitely been on the other side of facilitation, when the facilitator talks while you're trying to read, it's also incredibly annoying. So I hope that was welcome, and hopefully that was helpful for folks to kind of read through, process, and bring forth their ideas. Please keep in mind that the public comment session around these recommendations is still open until October 14th. I did send out a communications toolkit regarding how you can kind of get the word out about our public comment and encouraging your community members to provide their input. Please do take a look at that. That is a communications toolkit that can be used to, you can kind of copy paste that content into an email, plop it into a newsletter, or or a listserv posting that you might want to get out. We also have sample social media posts for Facebook and Twitter. So please do continue. As a task force member, we really are relying on you to tap into your communities and your networks to get people to members of the public to provide input on these recommendations, not only to the SEP section, but to all the other sections. As you all know, we have been working really hard to schedule these subcommittee meetings. The subcommittee meetings are not no longer just for designated subcommittee members, they're for all task force members. And so with that said, please keep in mind that our next subcommittee meeting is taking place next week on the definition of DI communities. That's taking place on October 6th from 3 to 6 p.m. And it's helpful if folks kind of read through, for example, this subcommittee coming up next week, read through the section on the definition of disproportionately impacted communities. We are fast approaching the finish line. So as you read through the recommendations, you as a task force members, please bring your perspectives and any feedback that you want to share on the recommendations so we can get them to a really refined place for that October meeting. The October 24th, 25th meeting will be taking place in Greeley. We've just locked in a location for the Greeley meeting, and we'll be sending out that information shortly. But thanks all again for all of your engagement, and we will end the meeting at this time. Thanks a lot.